standing in a crowded community meeting, watching a cancer patient barely able to stand being told by an entitled woman that she doesn't look sick enough to deserve a reserved seat. And then, just minutes later, that same patient collapses to the floor in a medical emergency that reveals a truth so devastating it brings the entire room to tears, including the woman who refused her mercy. What happened in those terrifying moments will change how you think about judgment, invisible illness, and the cost of cruelty. Elena Rodriguez had been fighting stage 4 breast cancer for 18 months. 18 months of chemotherapy that ravaged her body. Radiation that burned her skin, surgeries that left scars across her chest, and medications that made every single day feel like climbing a mountain with weights strapped to her ankles. Her doctors had told her that maintaining some normalcy, staying engaged with her community, could help her mental health during treatment. So when the Maplewood Heights HOA announced their annual Fall Festival planning meeting, Elena decided to attend, even though just getting dressed that morning had exhausted her so completely that her husband David had to help her put on her shoes. They arrived 15 minutes early specifically, because Elena's oncologist had submitted a medical accommodation request to the HOA board for reserved seating near the exit, not because Elena wanted special treatment, but because her compromised immune system meant she needed quick access to leave if she felt ill, and her extreme fatigue meant standing for the hour-long meeting simply wasn't physically possible without risking a collapse. David helped Elena into the community center, her thin frame leaning heavily on his arm, her teal beanie covering the patchy hair loss from her most recent chemo round, her oversized gray cardigan practically swallowing her 98-pound body that used to weigh a healthy 135. They headed toward the reserved seating area at the front of the meeting hall. 6 burgundy chairs with clear, reserved medical accommodation signs. But as they approached, Elena's heart sank. Veronica Blackwell, known throughout Maplewood Heights as the woman who'd reported 17 different neighbors for various HOA violations in the past year alone, was sitting in the center reserved seat, her bright crimson blazer and confident posture radiating territorial aggression, her designer handbag occupying the seat beside her, her expression daring anyone to challenge her presence. David approached politely, his voice tired but respectful. "Excuse me, ma'am. These seats are reserved for medical accommodations. My wife has a documented need." And he gestured to Elena, whose pale, gaunt face and obvious illness were visible to anyone with eyes. "Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to Rayan Review 2.0 for more real, emotional HOA stories." Veronica looked Elena up and down with cold assessment, her icy blue eyes narrowing, and then said the words that would haunt her forever. "You don't look that sick to me. I've seen people with cancer before, and they're in wheelchairs or hospital beds. You're walking just fine. Maybe you're exaggerating to get special treatment. These are the best seats, and I got here first. There are plenty of other chairs in the back." The casual cruelty of it hit Elena like a physical blow, the exhaustion and pain she'd been fighting all day suddenly overwhelming. Tears springing to her eyes not from self-pity, but from the sheer injustice of having to prove her suffering to a stranger who had no idea what it cost her just to be standing there. David's face flushed with anger, his protective husband instinct flaring. "My wife just had chemotherapy 3 days ago. She can barely stand. And you're seriously going to—" But Veronica cut him off, her voice loud enough that other arriving community members turned to watch. "I don't care about your sob story. I have rights too, and I'm not moving. If she's really that sick, she should be home in bed, not taking up space at community meetings." Other attendees were filtering into the room now, some recognizing Elena and looking shocked at the confrontation, others averting their eyes in that uncomfortable way people do when they witness injustice but don't want to get involved. And Elena, feeling dizzy and humiliated, tugged on David's arm and whispered, "It's okay. Let's just find other seats. I don't want to cause a scene," even though standing in the back might literally make her pass out. They moved toward the rear of the room, David's jaw clenched in fury, Elena's breathing becoming more labored with each step, and she finally sank into a chair in the back row, already feeling the warning signs her body gave when it was reaching its limit. The tunnel vision starting at the edges, the cold sweat on her forehead, the trembling in her hands. the racing heartbeat that signaled her body's systems were struggling. The meeting began, Margaret Chen, the elderly HOA board member, taking the podium and going through the agenda for the fall festival. Vendor assignments, parking logistics, volunteer schedules, and Elena tried to focus, tried to participate in the community life her doctors said was important. But the room was getting hazier, the voices sounding farther away, her body screaming that she'd pushed too far today. About 20 minutes into the meeting, during a discussion about festival decorations, Elena felt the unmistakable sensation that she was about to lose consciousness. That pre-fainting moment where your body gives you a 5-second warning before everything goes dark. And she tried to stand, tried to signal David that she needed to leave. But her legs gave out and she collapsed forward out of her chair, hitting the hardwood floor with a sickening thud that echoed through the suddenly silent meeting hall. If you're feeling this story, hit that like button and share this video to support Rayan Review 2.0. The room erupted into chaos, David dropping to his knees beside Elena's unconscious body, screaming her name, someone yelling, "Call 911!" and Margaret Chen rushing down from the stage, other community members jumping up to help, and Veronica, from her comfortable, reserved seat at the front, turned around to see what the commotion was about, her face still showing more annoyance at the interruption than concern. David was cradling Elena's head, checking her pulse, her body completely limp, her teal beanie having fallen off, revealing the devastating reality of her patchy, thinning hair, the physical evidence of chemotherapy's destruction that she'd been trying to cover with dignity. And someone shouted, "She's not breathing right!" Another neighbor, who was a retired nurse, pushed through the crowd, kneeling beside Elena, checking her airway, her pulse, her color, and she looked up at David with urgent concern. "How long has she been in treatment? What medications is she on? Does she have a port?" And David, his voice breaking, started rattling off information. Stage 4 breast cancer, 18 months of chemo. She's on adriamycin and Cytoxan. Yes, she has a port. She just had treatment on Wednesday. Her white blood cell count is critically low. She's supposed to avoid stress and exhaustion. And with each medical detail, the severity of Elena's condition became horrifyingly clear to everyone watching. Margaret Chen had her phone out calling 911, giving the address, explaining the medical emergency, and as she did, her eyes landed on Veronica still sitting in the reserved seat. And something in Margaret's expression shifted from concern to barely controlled rage. The retired nurse was doing everything she could to help Elena, who was starting to come around slightly, making small sounds, her eyes fluttering, and when she opened them, the first thing she saw was a circle of concerned faces looking down at her, and she whispered, barely audible, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to ruin the meeting." And that apology, the fact that even in her medical crisis she was worried about inconveniencing others, broke something in the room. David was crying openly now, holding his wife's hand, and he said to the crowd, to anyone listening, she didn't want to come today. She felt terrible. But her doctors said staying connected to community helps cancer patients mentally, gives them something to fight for. She's been fighting so hard for 18 months. Through surgeries and chemo and radiation, she's lost her hair, her strength, her ability to work. But she keeps trying, she keeps showing up, and all she needed was a place to sit where she could leave quickly if she got sick. That's all she asked for, just basic human compassion. Want to hear more life-changing HOA tales every week? Subscribe to Rayan Review 2.0 and never miss the next twist. The ambulance sirens were approaching, growing louder, and Veronica finally stood from the reserved seat, her crimson blazer suddenly looking garish and inappropriate, her face showing the first cracks of uncertainty as she processed what was happening, and she started to move toward the back of the room. But Margaret Chen stepped directly into her path. All 5'3" of this elderly woman radiating moral authority, and said in a voice that carried through the entire hall, "Veronica Blackwell, you will stay exactly where you are. Because when those paramedics get here and ask what happened, you're going to have to explain to them, to this community, and to yourself how you refused to give up a medically reserved seat to a stage 4 cancer patient because you didn't think she looked sick. Enough." The room went absolutely silent except for Elena's labored breathing and David's quiet sobs, and Veronica's face drained of color as the full weight of what she'd done landed on her. The paramedics arrived, rushing in with equipment, asking questions, checking Elena's vitals. And one of them, seeing the situation, the reserved seating signs, the obvious chemotherapy effects, said almost to himself, "Why isn't she in the accessible seating?" And David, his voice hollow, replied, "Because someone decided her cancer wasn't visible enough to deserve it." The paramedics loaded Elena onto a stretcher, her frail body looking even smaller against the medical equipment, and as they wheeled her out, she reached for David's hand and whispered something that only he could hear, something that made fresh tears stream down his face. And later he would tell people that she'd said, "Please don't be angry at that woman. She doesn't know what it's like. Being sick is hard enough without carrying hatred too." After the ambulance left, Margaret Chen made an announcement that there would be no more meeting today, that everyone should go home and reflect on what they'd witnessed. But before dismissing everyone, she looked directly at Veronica and said, "There's a reason we have medical accommodations in our community. Veronica, it's because we're supposed to take care of each other, especially the vulnerable among us. Not because someone meets your personal standard of looking sick enough, but because they're human beings deserving of basic dignity and compassion. And what you did today wasn't just cruel, it was dangerous. And it revealed something about your character that this community needs to address." Veronica tried to respond, tried to defend herself, saying, "I didn't know. How was I supposed to know she was really that sick? People lie about these things all the time." But her words rang hollow in a room full of people who'd just watched Elena collapse, who'd heard David's desperate medical litany, who'd seen the physical evidence of cancer's devastation. The community members began leaving, many in tears, several stopping to tell Veronica exactly what they thought of her behavior. One elderly man who was a Vietnam veteran saying, "I've seen a lot of cruelty in my life, ma'am, but what you did today ranks right up there, because it was cruelty wrapped in self-righteousness, which is the worst kind." Veronica left the community center alone, her expensive heels clicking on the hardwood floor, her designer bag clutched to her chest like armor. But there was no hiding from what had happened, no rationalizing it away, no rule or regulation that could justify her actions. That night, word spread through Maplewood Heights like wildfire, people texting, posting in neighborhood groups, sharing what they'd witnessed, and the consensus was universal. Veronica had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But here's where the story takes a turn that nobody expected. 3 days later, Elena was released from the hospital, severely dehydrated and weakened but stable, and when she got home, she found her porch covered in flowers, cards, meal delivery schedules organized by neighbors, offers to help with rides to treatment, cleaning, grocery shopping, childcare for her 2 kids, and in the middle of all of it, a single envelope with expensive stationery and shaking handwriting that could only be from one person. Elena opened the letter from Veronica while sitting in her living room, David beside her, both of them exhausted and emotionally drained, and what they read left them speechless. Veronica had written 6 pages, 6 pages of confession, shame, explanation, and genuine remorse that went deeper than either of them expected. She wrote about how she'd gone home that night and couldn't stop seeing Elena's collapse, couldn't unhear David's list of medical treatments, couldn't escape the image of Elena's hair loss revealed when her beanie fell off and something in her had shattered. She wrote about her own mother, who'd died of pancreatic cancer when Veronica was in her 20s, how she'd watched her mother waste away, how traumatic and helpless it had made her feel, and how somewhere along the way, she'd built walls of control and rules and judgment to protect herself from ever feeling that helpless again. But in doing so, she'd become the kind of person who inflicts the very pain she was trying to avoid. She wrote about how seeing Elena, really seeing her in that moment of collapse, had forced her to confront the fact that her mother had looked just like that near the end, frail, exhausted, trying to maintain dignity while her body betrayed her, and that by refusing Elena compassion, she'd essentially refused compassion to her own mother's memory, to every cancer patient who'd ever suffered in silence, to the part of herself that was still that scared 20-something watching her mom die. The letter didn't make excuses, didn't minimize what she'd done, but it did something rare. It showed genuine understanding of the harm caused and a commitment to change, not because of social pressure, but because of moral reckoning. Veronica wrote that she'd contacted the HOA board and donated $10,000 to create a permanent medical accommodation fund for any community member dealing with serious illness. Money for reserved parking, priority pool times, modified landscaping requirements, anything that could ease the burden of being sick in a world that expects you to function normally. She'd also volunteered to personally chair a new Invisible Illness Awareness Committee to educate the community about conditions that don't always look severe from the outside: chronic pain, autoimmune diseases, mental health conditions, cancer treatments, disabilities that aren't immediately visible. She wrote that she'd been meeting with Margaret Chen for daily conversations about empathy, privilege, and community responsibility, essentially submitting herself to mentorship about becoming a better human being. And then, at the end of the letter, Veronica asked for something that took tremendous vulnerability. She asked if, someday when Elena felt strong enough, she could hear Elena's story directly, not to absolve her guilt, but to truly understand the experience of the person she'd harmed, to learn from her perspective, to let Elena's humanity reshape her own. Elena sat with that letter for a long time, tears streaming down her gaunt face, and David expected her to be angry, expected her to tear it up or refuse any contact, but instead, she said something that embodied the grace that had defined her even in her darkest moments. She's hurting too, isn't she? Hurting people hurt people, and maybe this is how the cycle breaks. Maybe this is how we all learn to be better, one hard conversation at a time. 2 weeks later, Elena invited Veronica to her home for coffee, a meeting that David was skeptical about, but supported because he'd learned that his wife's capacity for compassion was somehow deeper than his own anger. Veronica arrived looking smaller somehow, less polished, wearing simple clothes instead of her power suits, carrying a potted orchid and a bag of Elena's favorite tea that she'd somehow researched. They sat in Elena's living room, the same room where she did her daily chemotherapy pills, where she rested between treatments, where she'd cried and fought and hoped for 18 months, and Elena, wrapped in blankets because chemo made her perpetually cold, told her story. She talked about the day she found the lump, the terror of the diagnosis, the impossible decisions about treatment options, the physical agony of chemotherapy that feels like poison burning through your veins because it literally is poison, the loss of her hair, which sounds vain, but actually represents the loss of the person you used to see in the mirror, the exhaustion so profound that brushing your teeth feels like running a marathon, the nausea that makes eating impossible, the mouth sores that make speaking painful, the neuropathy in her hands and feet that makes simple tasks like buttoning a shirt or walking to the mailbox feel insurmountable. She talked about the invisible aspects of cancer that nobody prepares you for, the chemo brain that makes you forget words mid-sentence, the terror every time you go for scans wondering if the cancer has spread, the guilt of watching your children and husband suffer alongside you, the isolation of being too sick to participate in normal life while watching everyone else continue on, the judgments from people who think you're being dramatic or lazy when you cancel plans because you're literally fighting for your life at the cellular level. She talked about the financial devastation even with insurance, the loss of her job, the medical bills that pile up, the emotional toll of becoming dependent on others for basic care, the indignity of needing help with things you used to do without thinking. And she talked about the small things that make survival possible: David's unwavering love, her children's drawings taped to her chemo bag, neighbors who quietly left meals without expecting thanks, friends who sat with her during infusions, and the hope, however fragile, that maybe she'd beat this. Maybe she'd get to see her kids graduate. Maybe she'd grow old with David. Maybe she'd survive. Thanks for watching Rayan Review 2.0, where every story teaches a lesson. Veronica listened to every word, crying openly, and when Elena finished, Veronica said, "I am so profoundly sorry, not just for the meeting, but for every moment of your struggle that I didn't see, for every other person I've judged without knowing their story, for the years I've spent being cruel in the name of rules and order when what really matters is the person standing in front of you." And then Veronica did something unexpected. She shared her own story about her mother's cancer, about being 23 and watching her mom deteriorate, about the helplessness and rage she'd felt, about how she'd coped by becoming controlling, by creating rigid structures in her life so she'd never feel that powerless. Again, about how that coping mechanism had turned into a prison that kept her from connecting with people, from feeling empathy, from being the kind of person her mother would have been proud of. The two women, one fighting cancer and one fighting the demons left by cancer's wake, sat together in that living room and found an unexpected connection in shared pain and the possibility of healing. Over the following months, Veronica became one of Elena's most dedicated supporters, driving her to treatments when David had to work, researching clinical trials and alternative therapies, organizing community fundraisers for Elena's medical expenses, using her organizational skills, previously used for HOA violations, to coordinate meal trains and cleaning schedules, and publicly advocating for invisible illness awareness throughout Maplewood Heights. She attended Elena's chemotherapy sessions, sitting quietly in the infusion center, witnessing firsthand the reality she'd been so quick to dismiss, seeing room after room of people fighting battles invisible to the outside world. The community watched this transformation with a mixture of skepticism and hope. Some thought Veronica was just performing penance. Others recognized genuine change, but everyone agreed that the way she'd mobilized resources for Elena showed a fundamental shift in priorities. At the Fall Festival planning meeting the following year, Elena, now in remission though still recovering, stood at that same podium where Margaret Chen had stood during her collapse, and she spoke to the community about invisible illness, about the importance of compassion over judgment, about how we never truly know what battles others are fighting. And she did something that brought the room to tears. She publicly thanked Veronica for her transformation, for choosing growth over defensiveness, for turning a moment of cruelty into a catalyst for community-wide change. Veronica, sitting in the audience, notably not in the reserved seats, wept as Elena spoke, and afterward they embraced in front of the entire community, two women whose lives had collided in the worst way possible, but who'd found a path through pain to something resembling redemption and friendship. The medical accommodation fund Veronica created has since helped 43 families in Maplewood Heights dealing with serious illnesses. The Invisible Illness Awareness Program has educated hundreds of residents, and the community center now has expanded accessible seating and resources for anyone dealing with health challenges. Elena's cancer journey continues. She has good days and hard days. Scans every 3 months that bring anxiety, the lingering effects of treatment that may never fully resolve. But she faces it with a community that sees her, supports her, and learned through her courage and Veronica's transformation that judgment is easy, but compassion requires bravery. Like, share, and subscribe for more emotional neighborhood dramas. Because this story teaches us that invisible illnesses are still real illnesses deserving of accommodation and respect. That our worst moments don't have to define us if we're willing to do the hard work of genuine change. That communities become stronger when they protect and support their vulnerable members. That judgment without knowledge is cruelty dressed as righteousness. And that sometimes the people who hurt us most can become our greatest allies if both parties are brave enough to choose healing over hatred. Because in the end, we're all fighting battles others can't see, and the measure of our humanity isn't whether we stumble, but whether we get back up, face what we've done, and commit to being better. One difficult conversation, one act of service, one moment of genuine compassion at a time.